I was saying, I thought it's going to be easier to get to Mars and build the kind of infrastructure that these young people have developed here than it will be to try and understand through computing how life emerged, because we actually need a quantum computer or maybe more to understand these kind of questions. So what I've dedicated the last few years of my life towards is really working towards getting there. And this has been an amazing indication and illustration of the kind of life that lies in store for the first people who get to Mars. And for me, that's really a step towards understanding those questions I was mentioning about what life is, where we come from, whether there is or may have been life on our next door neighbor planet Mars, whether or not we'll be able to establish life on Mars in a community structure, and what an exciting future. Yeah, so fantastic to hear from young people their perspective on what the future holds.
Yeah, so I'm fascinated to hear that you didn't really enjoy science at school. So I wonder whether a lot of the interest that you have in this area, Adriana, is really more to do with that sort of interest in the core of life as much as the space part. What was it for you, and how did that interest develop and manifest itself as you went through education and beyond?
Yeah, I think people have the impression of science that it's a kind of something far from their reality, something they haven't really been able to get their heads around, and this is particularly a message that I like to share with young people. Maybe you weren't lucky enough to have a teacher who could explain very clearly what the whole subject is about. But quite contrary to that perspective that many people have, I think science is part of who we are as humans. Science involves looking at the reality, whether it's through your own eyes or through complex experimental apparatus, looking at the reality that we find ourselves in and trying to find evidence in support.
That was the right thing to do.
Theories.
Down again.
Or different ways of seeing the world and answering different questions. So I think a curious nature and some experimentation to figure out what the answer to some questions that we have may be is really the root of science. And exploration really goes hand in hand, I think, with the curiosity that we all have as humans. So I think every child would admit to loving exploring and loving asking questions. Maybe we become adulterated as we get older into stopping being so inquisitive and asking big questions. But I think this is really important, and I think particularly in this era in which we live in, which especially in recent times is filled with uncertainty, perhaps anxiety, contradictions, a lot of different views of reality coming from different directions. It's very difficult to navigate the current scenario. So I think more than ever, embracing our curiosity, always asking questions, always questioning whether this is the way to do things or can we do things another way, is part of what it is to be human, and also part of the scientific endeavor in terms of figuring out more about this beautiful solar system and universe that we find ourselves in.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll come back to the space and Mars part later. But just as we're on that track, talk to us a bit more about your work at the Foundation for Space Development. That sounds like a space thing. The work, as I understand it, really deals much more with inspiring kids through science and technology. What's the nature of that work, Adriana? How what experiences have you seen from that sort of shaped your view, and how have you managed to influence the education of kids that organisation has managed to touch the lives of?
Yeah, so the founding director of the foundation is my very good friend and now colleague in the foundation, Carla Sharp. And her vision was to build Africa's first technology mission to send to the moon. So that's the project by which we hope to inspire the next generation. So she's currently the business manager at the Square Kilometre Array Radio Telescope, which South Africa won the bid to host here in South Africa. Also parts of it are being established in Australia and also around Africa with single dishes, but the main portion of it is here in South Africa. So this brought up the idea of putting a radio telescope on the far side of the moon. So this will enable new science because the radio spectrum that comes into the far side of the moon is not something we have access to because of the ionosphere here on Earth. So we'll in fact be able to detect and do new science from the far side of the moon. This would be not the first time that we've landed on the far side of the moon, of course, because the Chinese put a rover and some other equipment down last year. They've been investigating crop growth amongst other activities on the far side, which I think is an interesting indication of what China has in mind. But it's time for Africa to really actively participate in the space industry, we believe. We've got a massive amount of the equator in our continent, which is ideal for cheap and easy launching. So we think Africa really needs to rally together. Hopefully in the next few years, we see this launch first to the space station to test out these inflatable balls that will form different network nodes of this telescope that kind of mimics what the SKA would do in terms of a distributed set of dishes looking at signals coming from space. First, a test in the space station, and secondly, an actual launch to the moon, which she's already secured by sponsorship in terms of getting some space in other people's launches. So if that goes off, I think we will have done our job in terms of inspiring young people around the world, and particularly in developing areas of the world, that space is an area where everyone can collaborate and benefit from.
Great, great. Okay, so coming back to today, including with the success of the SpaceX mission and the sort of timely delayed launch of that in relation to this discussion today. Interesting that sort of first time in 9 years the US have done that. Clearly it feels to be pretty significant in terms of achieving that, the basis of a commercially viable mode of accessing space. How important do you think that is in relation to a new future in relation to space exploration and potential Mars habitation?
Yeah, so all through America with the hashtag Launch America, I think Americans have been celebrating this launch, but let me shed some light on perhaps a different way of looking at it. So SpaceX is the brainchild and now the successful enterprise of South African-born Elon Musk. And yes, it's the first time that a commercial entity has achieved crewed launch from Earth ever. But more importantly than the commercial aspect, I think, is the capability that a single person has, a single person born in Africa, to implement such a thing for the first time. So that shows that in this era that we're living in, yes, assisted by the kind of economic model that we're experiencing where a billionaire can now enter the space industry. But I think the message there is the power of the individual, that not allowing others to tell you that your goals are impossible or improbable. Going ahead can result in such a revolution for a big nation like the US in terms of celebrating what essentially Elon Musk's company has done. Established in 2002, a relative newcomer to the space industry, launching astronauts from the US for the first time in almost a decade. So largely unmentioned also is the pride with which Kazakhstan, argue it has been in the Russian part of Kazakhstan in Baikonur, where I had the opportunity to visit, in fact, has been launching crew since the US space program was discontinued almost a decade ago. So that was done by the Russians out of a part of Kazakhstan that's operated by Russia. So that's how astronauts have been getting to the space station in the Soyuz capsule, which we're familiar with. It's been around for some years now, since the Apollo era. So I think this is a new era for the space industry. We're seeing partnerships between private and public enterprises, for example, the SpaceX NASA launch. But personally, for me, I think this has been a huge stepping stone towards getting to Mars, because Elon Musk established SpaceX with the endeavor of making humans multiplanetary. In the long run, this is really the only way that our species will survive. If we look very far into the future, beyond our lifetimes, we need to exist on more than one planet, and we eventually need to leave the solar system. So this is an important step in terms of getting crew to space, the space station, first of all, to the moon. That would be the next step for SpaceX, and later to Mars and beyond. And we watch with great excitement on the developments of the Starship, which will be able to lift tens of metric tons off of the surface of Earth, accommodate crews of around 100, and hopefully make us multi-planetary in terms of delivering humans to off-world communities, hopefully in our lifetimes.
Interesting. I think that this aspect of what an individual can do by inspiration is an interesting one. It feels like it shouldn't need to be about an individual, but if you go back to the the start of near the start of space exploration, the Kennedy's vision and even speech, which completely captivated a whole decade. Is in our innovation world is often cited as maybe the best example of setting a really ambitious vision and a plan to achieve it and go for it. And I think it does often need someone to be that inspirational figurehead that can really harness enthusiasm in the way that Kennedy did. He drove funding out of Congress, to make it happen, and NASA really pushed the boundaries of science, maths, physics, engineering to achieve that. Do you think that we maybe are at the beginning of a new era? And because it's that to be 50 years ago, in some way you could say a disappointing amount has happened in the last 50 years. We might have a different view on that, but it certainly feels like there's a potential for a new impetus in that, perhaps with the sort of drive that someone like Elon Musk can bring to this. What's your thoughts on whether we can really start with a new era here?
Yeah, so firstly, let me commend Elon Musk on his comments just before the launch, where he said that if it succeeds, it's due to the teams at SpaceX and NASA. So these kind of things, of course, don't happen through the sole actions of an individual, but rather huge teams of people, a lot of time and a lot of effort. If it failed, it would be his fault. So let me say the power of the individual is something, but the power of the team is, of course, always more. In terms of what we have achieved, what I often share with people that maybe we've forgotten is that we've had the capability of landing technology on Mars since the 1970s. We're coming up for the 50th anniversary of the Viking landers on the surface of Mars from 1976. So that leads me to my next point, which is what is the biggest hurdle to getting crew to Mars? And I think that's a lack of imagination. Yes, a lack of funding and all of those other boring parts, but a lack of imagination, because technologically we've had the capability to send things to Mars for nearly 50 years. So you're right. It's high time that all of those people inspired by having watched the Apollo missions and subsequent missions in the 60s and 70s, who are still around, to hopefully see a re-emergence of our spacefaring capabilities, because indeed there has been some lull in the leaps and bounds that we've been making. But I think the time is right now. I think the reason that we are going to Mars is yes, because it's hard, an echo of what Kennedy had said in the 60s, not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And I think the reason we need to do hard things is because we're in sort of a quite pressing, I don't want to say desperate, but situation here on Earth. A lot of challenges are looming, and we're already in the midst of them. We have, a massively growing population, 8 billion humans and counting. As far as we know, there's never been a population of humans that large on this planet before. We've got resource management issues. Billions of people don't have access to things like clean water and healthcare and education in a way that we would like to imagine as possible. When we couple this with the impact of our massive technological growth and the industry that's required for this technological growth on the climate, we see that the activity of humans is having an impact on not only the climate, but the general biosphere in which we live. We're in the midst of a species extinction event. So I don't want to harp on about all the bad things. I think we all read about them and either ignore them or feel depressed about them. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel, I believe. because I believe there are massive parallels between the kind of lessons we will learn by attempting to achieve something really difficult, like getting the first communities to Mars and setting up, successful societies there, in terms of resource management, in terms of, asking ourselves, how little can we live with? What do we really need to be human and to be happy? To reimagine, what our society sort of represents, because I think this consumerist kind of materialistic culture that we've ended up in now is no longer serving us. It can no longer serve us, because with increasing numbers of people living on the planet, we're not going to have enough to go around. So yes, we need to use technologies to be more resource efficient, but we also need to, I think, redefine, what do we stand for? What are we doing here? What is our place in the solar system and in the galaxy? And I think exploration and curiosity are really important aspects of that. And each person will, of course, have a different answer for what their vision of the future is. But for me, it's about really embracing exploration. And in that sense, the voyage to Mars is not only something that I really plan to do, but also a story, an aspiration, a metaphor, let's say, for what we should be looking towards as a vision for the future, which I think is doing things that we feel proud of. And for me, Mars really represents that.
Yeah, you touched on some really interesting points there. Because I think some people, in thinking about space exploration on Mars, they might consider that spending time and money and energy on that might be better served on dealing with the issues we've created on our own planet, for where we live now. You've touched on maybe some of the reasons as to why that might be relevant and important to that. It's not a question of, I don't think you're going to say that we're looking to abandon ship, as it were. But what would be your sort of response to maybe some people having that type of view about where we should focus our energy and our efforts?
Yeah, that's a good question, which people do raise. So I think we just need to take stock of what exactly happens when we fund such a thing as a mission to Mars. So, probably as much as hundreds of thousands of people may work on the project, various aspects, from the agricultural system to the solar array to the whatever aspects of the infrastructure that we need to develop for those people there. Many people on Earth will contribute to the mission. But in the end, what leaves Earth is, and I've said it previously, a few tens of tons and maybe 100 people that zip off to the planet Mars. That's what Earth loses. What does Earth gain? I think Earth gains a new perspective. People on Earth get to look up at that sort of orangey brownish, not star, but planet that we can see in the night sky, and know that people are living there. And I think once we can achieve this milestone, it really opens up a whole new plethora of opportunities for young people in terms of thinking out the box, imagining new ways of doing things. And that's just in an aspirational sense. I think in a practical sense, it will teach us all sorts of ways to be more resource efficient, because that's the way that we will survive on Mars. So I think not only is this going to be beneficial to Earth, but I think it's really necessary at this point that we drastically shift the way we think about resources and the way we think about ourselves, because being in the midst of this extinction event is a reminder. And the pandemic, I must say, is a very mild kind of reminder compared to the kinds of apocalyptic events that we can imagine. So let's take this opportunity to think that this is a wake-up call, that the trajectory we're on is not sustainable. The sort of consumerist-driven society that we're in now is not sustainable. We've reached the end point of that accumulation of material possessions being the goal of our society. We're at the end of that point. So now we need to define a new trajectory. And in that sense, this is a really exciting road that we're on. Each of us is alive at this moment in history to play a role, I believe. So we each need to find that role, find what we feel passionate about, and define a new set of perhaps values and principles on which to rebuild our society. So in that sense, I think the lockdown and the pandemic are, although tragic for many people who have suffered during and will suffer during this event, it's also, we have to look at the other side of the coin and say that it's an opportunity. to rethink. It's an opportunity to restructure, to shed away the layers that are no longer serving us. You know, for people who've lost jobs, perhaps it's an opportunity to think about other ways of making a living. For people who are, you know, tired of living in their flat in the city, maybe this is a chance to move out of the city and find other ways to live outside of these overcrowded cities. I'm not sure, these are just some examples. But I think this has been an opportunity, so I think we shouldn't waste this one. We should try to emerge from this sort of global catastrophe in some sense, with some ideas about what kind of future we want to build and how we're going to contribute to that.
That's a great point. I like the thinking about imagining what you would need to exist on another planet, and you know, replaying back that to what that means for the resources we use today on Earth. Now you're due, I think, next year sometime to sort of spend some time in Antarctica, and you are that sort of off-world experiment to prepare for remote habitation on Mars or wherever. Tell us a bit more about that, and what you expect to do, what you expect to learn from it. You perhaps touched on it in terms of some of your answer to the question on sustainability, and you know, and maybe perhaps the enforced lockdown, or how that may have shaped your view of what that experience might be like. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so I must say I feel almost guilty in this lockdown, thinking about sustainability, about how much I traveled last year, because I feel as though sharing a message was important, but now we need to really consider whether traveling as much as some of us have done is really sustainable in the long run. Anyway, at least I got that all done last year. I think I was on a different continent each week on average, or something ridiculous, and even visited Antarctica at the end of the year. So this was attending events to share the launch of the movement I'm calling Proudly Human with audiences around the world. But also to do location scouts for our upcoming off-world project, as you've mentioned. So I went to Antarctica in the summer, a very different experience to what we planned to do, which is spend the winter there. So the conditions in Antarctica during the winter give some of the closest parallels to what it might be like to live on Mars in terms of the temperature. So I was there in summer, and the temperatures were quite warm this year at around 0, so I don't think that's very impressive. But in the winter, we hope to go further inland to a location where temperatures will be around -60, -70 degrees Celsius, because the average temperature on Mars is around -63. So this is a really accurate then experience of how the plumbing systems will respond, how the solar panels, etc., will respond. The wind speeds in Antarctica are extreme, so the wind turbines are another challenge that we were investigating in terms of what kind of design we would use in like 300 kilometer per hour winds, the highest speeds in the world. That's Antarctica. But another aspect of Antarctica that's a really close analog with a community on Mars is the isolation. So Antarctica is the only part of the world where you cannot leave or get resupply missions or anything during the winter. No ship can crack through the ice. No pilot can be expected to try to land in the dark and the stormy conditions that can prevail during winter. So for the around 9 months of the winter, you're stuck there with whatever you've brought with you and whoever you've gone with. That's your reality. So this aspect of it is particularly interesting for what we want to test. So at Proudly Human, through these off-world experiments, we want to not only develop not the technology itself, we have technology partners, but we want to develop a certain stack of this technology, a certain integration of these different technologies that can work for a specific environment. But on top of that, and a more difficult challenge perhaps, we want to understand how the people respond to the technology infrastructure, to each other, internally as well as sort of externally, in terms of the team dynamics in these extreme environments. So that's one aspect of what we plan to do in the future. Next, we hope to go to a desert environment. So Ethiopia and the Danakil Depression in the Dalol Deserts is my favorite candidate location for the hot part. This is the hottest on average place on Earth. Because of the geothermal activity under the ground, as well as the blazing sun from above. Temperatures don't drop below sort of 35, even in the depths of the night. So in the day, you're looking at 50 degrees. At night, it's like dropping to the 30s. So we hope to live live there also for a period of a few months, again testing technology, including 3D printing from sand, including water management, which obviously will be a great challenge in the desert environment, while in Antarctica, of course, water is quite abundant. So by the different aspects of these environments, first the off-world Antarctica, then off-world Ethiopia, then we hope to live under the ocean. And then in the next sort of 6 to 10 years, we plan to be ready to contribute as a private entity to the expeditions that will take crews to the moon, back to the moon, and next to Mars, because this is an area where not a huge amount of work is being done as far as we can see. So we trust in SpaceX to develop the transport system, and then Proudly Human hopes to contribute to the kinds of infrastructure, but more importantly, the kinds of teams and the kinds of dynamics that emerge in the relation between the infrastructure and the teams in combination. So that would be our contribution. Whatever planet we're on, we want to develop resource efficient technology infrastructures and community spirit. So that was my year last year, a whirlwind world tour. And then we were locked down earlier this year. So I felt like I had to keep the momentum going for this off-world project. So it took a bit of a turn where I've now called it off-world lockdown. So we had started building a cabin in an inaccessible valley earlier this year. We didn't know we would be locked down in it for now almost 70 days. So we're coming up on 10 weeks. In a cabin that we built from scratch. So we haven't introduced any fancy technologies. We don't even have solar power because there's not enough sun down there. We don't have wind turbines or wastewater management systems or anything. We've gone as cheap and as lightweight and as quick and as easy to buy in the sort of flurry before lockdown at the various hardware stores in our area to build this cabin. So we carried almost 2 tons of equipment down a 1 kilometer path where the drop in altitude is 220 meters. So I always like to think that's a quarter of Table Mountain. And we carried 2 tons of stuff down there in multiple trips, including wooden poles, cement, wooden planks, corrugated sheets for the walls, plastic for the walls, rainwater tank, car batteries for power. Yeah, we don't think there's enough sunlight there actually for solar, but let's see come summer how we can look into that. Luckily the river is clean, so we have water, we have a rainwater tank. Our food is from the shop currently, but we do plan to look at growing food come spring. And communication systems, we bought a router with those old long bunny ears, which seems to help somewhat, but not always. So that's us. And I mean, these are the challenges that humans face wherever they are. You know, you could be living in an informal settlement in an overcrowded city center, in Antarctica, on the moon, on Mars. You know, the basic resource requirements are the same: power, water, food, and communication systems. And these are the aspects that we've been challenged with daily. But of course, many people on Earth live in far more dire conditions and far more resource constrained conditions. So this has really been a learning experience in terms of thinking, you know, how many liters of water do you need per day to be happy? You know, how many kilograms of food are you going to carry down that hill to get enough? Do you need a hot shower? You know, all of these questions come to mind, and I think it's more about the mindset that we've been training down there. You know, can you live with less? You know, what does it take to be a happy member of a community? Yeah, so the signal has been challenging, but again, this is great training for Mars, because we know the delay of signal there will be you know, between 10 and 20 minutes. So the poor signal we have down there is nothing compared to what's in store.
And who is that team, Adriana? Is that a sort of consistent team or a range of different people that you're calling on to support you with that?
So my partner and I are living down in the cabin, but we hope, let's see how South Africa, how the government regulates travel going forward, but we hope to proceed with a launch in Cape Town later this year, where we'll open applications for a team of 4 to the public. So my vision is to have a team of 4 students and young entrepreneurs, either enrolled in some sort of tertiary education institutes or working in a startup, where this could be a film. You could have film capabilities because we want to document everything. You could be in a solar panel startup. You could be studying electrical engineering. These kinds of skills we would need. You could be a counselor or a psychologist. These are also the kinds of skills people need. So we hope to demonstrate what we mean, not in an extreme environment, but in the beautiful location of Cape Town, by building a prototype habitat, similar in design and structure to the one that we will eventually take and fabricate in Antarctica. And then we'll iterate, improve it and take and fabricate in Ethiopia. And after many iterations, we hope to come up with some kind of design in terms of ease of living and also functionality that could eventually be the home for people on the Moon, Mars, and beyond. So if all goes to plan, we will open applications later this year. So we don't have a specific team in mind. We believe, all humans have the skills necessary to contribute to a community, of course. It's an interesting thought experiment there, I guess, for people to think about what project they would work on in this environment. And maybe lockdown has been an opportunity to think about that. Maybe people have been working from home, but maybe not. Has your love for gardening been reinvigorated, for cooking? And these are, of course, skills that are going to be necessary. We'll have a big agricultural unit. Wherever a community is, food will come from there. Preparing meals for people is most certainly an aspect of that. So all sorts of skills are required for living on the Moon, Mars, and beyond. So I think it's a great opportunity for people to think about how do they contribute to community spirit? What are your personal characteristics that can provide people with the functionality required to survive, but also to make their day better?
Yeah, it strikes me as an incredibly important aspect. Obviously, there's the consideration of what precious resources you access and how you have technology to support it. But the human aspect is incredibly important, isn't it? It really tests. Many of us have been tested in a different way over this lockdown period, and asked new questions of ourselves. And I think in an isolated environment, how people interact, work, and live together, how to build a society, I guess, is part of what particularly interests you, and is a key part of this project, isn't it?
Yes, so in fact, I've even dived into another PhD where we're looking at team dynamics in extreme environments. And I think we can say the extreme environment is somewhere like Antarctica, but in fact, whether you're looking in your own company or in your own family or in your own community, we're all essentially humans working in teams in some kind of trying conditions. So I think it's an interesting time to reflect on one's personal principles and priorities. What holds meaning for you in this life, and perhaps even more important opportunity is to reflect on the kind of behavior that you're engaged in. Do your daily behaviors reflect your priorities and principles, or have these maybe gone astray, which they do for all of us? So it's a great thought experiment, I think, and perhaps a practical one to think how you could apply for some of these missions. So Antarctica, perhaps Ethiopia, we're going to go ahead with first. We're going to aim for next year. Of course, everything's up in the air now. Perhaps Antarctica 2022. And we'll be opening applications globally to any individual that can make a pitch for why they would be a great addition to the team. And I think, I'm not sure who said it now, but let me refer to whoever said it first, that we're all the crew on Spaceship Earth. We're not passengers, we're the crew. And I think now is the time to really take responsibility for our actions in the next few years, because these will be more important than we think. We're at a very dynamic time in the history of the planet. So given that, coupled with the global communications network that we enjoy and have all been enjoying more to lesser extents down in the valley, but having the internet really enables an idea, I think, to spread with far more breadth and far more speed than ever before. So I think all of us, whether we're at home or back at work, that our big ideas can make a difference, and that our actions have far more power than we may imagine in sort of determining the trajectory of our society from here forward.
So one thought that I was having really around is how creativity often flourishes in constrained conditions. In some ways, creativity doesn't need a wide open space. It's sometimes, the blank page fears are actually often those constraints make us more creative, either because we're challenged with new problems to solve, or the scarcity of resources actually forces ingenuity with the resources that we have. Do you think that's true? And is that something that you'd be looking to really leverage with, with an off-grid community, whether that's in an experiment or in some other planet location? Is that a necessary part of how you build a new society and have new ideas to drive the development of that through creativity?
Yeah, I think so. Creativity, and maybe I'd couple in collaboration with that or let's say, when one approaches a collaboration, keeping an open mind will often enable the kinds of creativity that you may not have had in mind in the beginning of the project. So with that kind of spirit, I think we're approaching each of these iterations of the off-world experiment with an open mind. So some things are not negotiable, like if you're living in a negative 60 degrees Celsius environment, you're going to need your power systems to be working in order to keep you warm. Otherwise, it's a rather swift ending to the project. So some things are non-negotiable, and these are the power, I think, water, air, food, and communication systems. When we're thinking more broadly in terms of human communities, healthcare and education, then of course also basic necessary requirements. But I think through connectivity, we can enable a lot of applications of education and even healthcare more recently. So once we have those things in mind, and of course the technologies that we start with may not be the ones that we eventually end up wanting to use further. Once you've got that basic infrastructure in place, then the really interesting stuff starts. So the kinds of questions we'd like to investigate are, did a group meditation session in the morning impact people's clarity of thought and ability to perform their tasks later in the day? Did a karaoke session one night, really help to bond people together? Perhaps as we've been experimenting here in South Africa, perhaps some home brew in one of these awful experiments helps for team cohesion. Or it's even though I've now listed sort of physical examples, I think I'm trying really to keep a very open mind and let the people that apply to come and join the project really determine the direction. To cite another example, perhaps in Ethiopia, there are very sparse groups of people living in this extremely harsh environment, as I've described, like 50 degrees Celsius during the day. The Afar people are very proud and with a long historic background living in that area. So one of the aspects we want to add to the Off-World Ethiopia experiment is to try to learn from this culture. How do they deal with this climate? Where do they source their food and their water? Can we incorporate this thinking and this culture into the kind of technological setup that we have in mind? How do these groups interact? Because what people think of when they think of Mars is an uninhabited planet. But this will only be the case for the first group that gets there. Right? After that, every other group that comes will arrive to a planet with people already living there. People who've got some fairly strong ideas about how things should be done, probably because they've managed to survive. So a really important aspect of expanding our society beyond Earth is, intercultural collaboration, learning from each other rather than this being a source of conflict. So I'm really excited about how complete unknowns like, what will the Afar community think about our experiments? So I need to travel there on a location scout to meet with some of the leaders of those communities in the area where we hope to establish our base, and establish what kind of things we could collaborate on, like is a water filtration system that works on solar power, something that we could scale and leave with the community after we leave. What kind of aspects of the hierarchy within the community have been shaped through time to be the most effective way of surviving. So I think there's keeping an open mind will enable you to achieve even more than what you may expect, I think, especially when collaborating with diverse groups.
It sounds like it'll be a fascinating series of experiments. I hope the lockdown situation allows those to continue, and look forward with a lot of interest to how that's going. I'm sure there'll be lots of great learning from a human social perspective, as well as what you might learn more broadly. I just wanted to touch a bit on technology. I know that we undertook a survey a couple of years ago at the Global Innovation Forum conference, and a poll of the audience have revealed that new technologies were sort of seen as one of the sort of key drivers for innovations across sort of businesses and organisations broadly, Adriana. You've touched on it a bit, some of the key things, but I'd be interested just for you to share a bit about what you see as being, I guess, the important technologies and where you see those going, in part to support, things like space travel, but how those have a value to play in sustainable futures on Earth as well. So what can you sort of speak to on that topic?
Yeah, so our technology has been exploding in terms of development in the past few decades, which is unprecedented in our history as far as we know. So this is something to celebrate. But perhaps the message I would have is that we need to think about why we are innovating. Yes, it should be curiosity driven, but I think the end goal is perhaps not to fill our lives with so many gimmicks and devices that our mind becomes clouded about with all these pings going off with different messages arriving, and even the toaster is now connected to the internet. I think now's the point to take a step back. Maybe you can go build yourself a cabin in a forest somewhere and think about it. But now's the time to reflect on what's really necessary, I think. And for me, as an example, one of the most important directions in which to develop, I think, is in biomimicry, as some people would call it. It goes by other names. In fact, this was a great topic at the recent Global Innovation Forum that I attended by one of the speakers. So I've done research in photosynthesis, and if you're looking for inspiration for new technologies, I think the biological world has a wealth of knowledge which we are really far from understanding. And if we want to understand how to live in harmony with the environment, rather than continuously extract resources from it to the extent that we destroy our own life support system, which is another option, if we want to live in harmony with the environment, there's so many living things to get inspiration from like fungi to bacteria to viruses, perhaps, or is that too controversial? But in terms of photosynthesis, this is a really efficient way to absorb sunlight and convert it into the power in which the organism then lives. And we are really far from the efficiency that we observe in photosynthetic organisms. So yes, we want highly efficient solar photovoltaics that we can absorb sunlight with and use to power all our activities really efficiently. But another really important message from nature then, and not only in terms of efficiency, but in terms of what resources do you use to create the system that performs photosynthesis? And the answer that plants and other photosynthetic organisms will give you is whatever's lying around. Plants grow freely by themselves in almost any kind of environment that you plant seeds in. So that's the kind of thinking that we need to develop now, is if you plonk someone down in some kind of environment somewhere, the first thing you need to do is look around and see what resources are available and try to develop in a way that's in harmony with that environment, in terms of building the different, modifications to the environment that you would like to build. So organic photovoltaics are one example of that, without these rare metals that are not really sustainable then in the long run anyway. So yeah, I think innovation is fantastic. Technological development is fantastic, but every now and then I think we need to take count of where we're headed with this, and are these devices going to make us better people and a better society? And if so, then yes, let's go for it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So I think we've just about had Adriana, so it's been fascinating to understand about your work and your thoughts. Some great topics covered, not just about space, but really much more about how we live as humans and how we create societies that work. So I'm sure lots of us would very much echo your sentiments there. So just for everyone, just to let you know that the recording of this will be available on the GIF YouTube channel tomorrow, and we've got lots more seminars coming up. So we've got one on Thursday where Shafi Ahmed, who's a multi-award winning cancer surgeon, a bit of a TV star, who's a pretty interesting character. He's going to be talking about how we can use innovation to future-proof healthcare. Another brilliantly topical subject and speaker. But thanks very much today to you, Adriana, for shining a light a bit on your work. I can't quite imagine how that is to contemplate the sort of future that you imagine for yourself. But we wish you all the best, and I'd love to hear more about how your experiments go. When, just as a final one, when might what's your guess as to when you or someone else might set foot on Mars?
So yeah, thanks Craig for all the great questions, and this one included, and also for the fantastic illustrations. Well, I'm going to dive into that now. But yeah, it's been a real pleasure and a good question to end on. So I think SpaceX are the people to watch in terms of pioneering crewed transport. So I was in Mexico to see Elon Musk live in 2015 announce plans to launch cargo to Mars in the early 2020s. So if that goes ahead and we see SpaceX capable of landing cargo on the surface of Mars, potentially with the Starship or perhaps some further iteration, then I think before 2030 or in the 2030s would not be an unrealistic time frame. So yeah, personally I'm 36, so 10 years time would be good for me. 40 years time would be not so good. So let's watch this space. But I don't think it's unrealistic to think that we will be observing the expansion of our society beyond Earth to Mars and perhaps beyond in the next decade.
Yeah, very exciting, very exciting. Great to talk to you, and all the best for you and your family then in South Africa.
Thanks, Craig. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks, Adriana.